Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to do a little talk like I have done in the past, and I plan on doing quite a few in the future, pulling out some of the books from my library and talking about various subjects. And the subject I wish to talk about here is the White House. The White House that was, of course, built in what was called Washington City, honoring George Washington, who was one of the greatest founding father, who was our first president, and arguably our greatest president. And he set up the property. He picked the area where the White House would be, laid the cornerstone, but it would not be completed until the second president moved in 1800. Washington died, of course, in December of 1799, so he never saw the building in use, but he saw it pretty much completed. One of the things that's rather fascinating about the White House is the various changes that took place, how things were affected, and there are countless books. I have lots of books in the library that have a chapter per se on the White House. There are several books that are dedicated to the White House. I didn't pull them out, but they're well known. I pulled out only 3 books because I think they cover 3 very important moments in the history of the building. And you have to remember the first occupant was John Adams for a very, very short tenure, and then Thomas Jefferson, and then James Madison. And we had a lot of issues with other countries, including France and England. And eventually in 1812, we declared war on England, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. And one of the things that we did during the War of 1812, the United States invaded Canada because we wanted to take it and make it part of our country. Well, we didn't realize how strong Canada was, and Canada pretty much defeated us. But while we were there, we did some really despicable things. We went to one area of Canada and burned down their House of Parliament. We affected some of their buildings, residences, and the like, and then left a trail of destruction. Now, of course, the English looked at this and said, well, if you're going to do it to us, we'll do it to you. And they came to Washington, and they burned down the White House, the Capitol, and a couple of other buildings. To a degree, fortunately, that saved the White House to a degree, at least the outer shell, was a tropical storm came through after the fires and put everything out, which saved the shell of the White House and the Capitol. And, of course, at that point, the government had to kind of move around, and the presidency had to go to someplace, and they went to Octagon House. And that's where the White House was for a while. And this first book I'm pulling out here is very important because it's from the original library of the Octagon House. In fact, I always leave all this information inside. This book belonged to Colonel John Taylor III. And it was kept at his home called the Octagon House. And it is marked inside Octagon 102 1818, as you will notice right here inside. This is part of his library. Now, of course, the president had moved out by that time, but this is all part of his library. And of course, it was an important government building. It remains an important government building. Don't believe all the stupid nonsense you hear about paranormal activity there. That's nonsense. Half the information I've read about it is incorrect. But that's a totally different subject. But this is from the Octagon House. And I guess if it's so damn haunted, they should be doing something here, because this is part of it. But they don't worry. It's nonsense. And so the house had to be rebuilt. The Capitol had to be rebuilt. Washington was a mess. And of course, as time went on, by the time Madison's administration is almost over, it is completed, and then of course James Monroe moves in. And through Monroe and John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, there are great additions and improvements made to the house. And it remains that way, all the way through to the days of the Civil War, past the Civil War. And then you have the administration of William McKinley. And of course, William McKinley's kind of interesting, but the fella who was earlier than him is even more interesting, which I should mention here, and that was Benjamin Harrison. He kind of is sandwiched between Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland's on each side of him. And during the Harrison administration, the Edison Company electrified the White House. And the fellow that did it was a fellow by the name of Ike Hoover. And Ike Hoover was, of course, an electrician, and he wired the whole White House. And the White House was lit beautifully. It had been gas, and the gas lighting had been put in during the Polk administration. And of course, Sarah Polk refused to allow one room not to be gas lit, and she wanted candles. And interestingly enough, the gas went off many times, and the only room lit was the room with the candles with Sarah Polk. But once we get into the Harrison administration, the house is electrified, and they ran the electric wires through the gas lines. The Harrisons were terrified of electric lights, and they refused to touch the switches. So the electrician, named Ike Hoover, as I mentioned before, was asked to stay there and put the lights on and off. And as things changed, he eventually became the chief usher of the White House and spent a lifetime there and wrote some fascinating things in his book, Upstairs at the White House by Ike Hoover. He lasted until the days of practically Herbert Hoover. And so, interesting history here. Due to the technology, Ike Hoover, of course, became the chief usher. And he started a process that many other chief ushers have done, is write books about their tenure at the White House and the occupants of it, which are quite fascinating. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about the White House, getting back to William McKinley, which I started with, of course, a lot of things changed during the administration of William McKinley. He's really kind of our first modern president. We have a war office. We have a press room. The telegraph, the telephone, everything is there. So there's always constant communication coming from the White House. And of course, we had the Spanish-American War at that time. And of course, McKinley holds various conferences, press conferences. His secretary basically does it with the press. And this is the beginnings of the modern White House. Now, of course, William McKinley will be assassinated in 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt will become president. And Theodore Roosevelt is a character of the highest order. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because he was a character of the highest order. He had a personality, as I believe it was the French ambassador once said, that after you meet the president, it takes about 3 days to get his personality out of your clothes. Okay, he was just at you, and he was explosive, he was theatrical, he was emotional, he was everything. He was a 3-ring circus, and when that didn't work, he had the rest of his family, which filled in. And believe me, it was a wild place. And during the time of President Theodore Roosevelt's tenure, he decided to modernize the White House from what it had been. Because, as I said, it had been electrified. They had brought in, gas lighting. They had brought in internal plumbing, all kinds of things like that. But still, it was the same old building. And Theodore Roosevelt wanted things changed. There was a whole area of sheds that held plants, like glass sheds and whatever, for displaying all the various flowers and whatever. He had all of that torn down and added wings to the White House, executive offices and things like that. The whole thing that was done during that time, which is quite fascinating, is that parts of the building were sagging a little bit, and they added bits and pieces here to support it better. And they modernized things. Now, of course, that leads us to another book. This is a book that came out in the beginning of the 20th century, The Inside History of the White House. And it's quite fascinating. This was a Christmas present to a young fella named John R. looks like Winans from Father. And that was in December 25th, 1908. And this is a fascinating book. It talks about all kinds of things that were going on, shows countless pictures of how the White House looked in 1905, 1906, and even before that point. There's a lot of older photographs as well. And the interesting thing is the White House changes and keeps changing, is adapted. People are cutting in various things and affecting various supports of the building because of adding modern conveniences. During the Coolidge administration, the White House is altered again and an extra floor is added. And in there was this massive truss that was put in to support everything. It had been put in, before. And after adding all of these things in, the improvements from the 1902 renovation, where lots of things were put in, and then the 1920s revision, adding another floor and things like that, it just started to make the whole building start to sag. Of course, it stayed like that for a while. And during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration, it stayed the same. And then Harry S. Truman became president due to the death of Franklin Roosevelt. And one of the things that's rather fascinating is that the house was standing, as one wag put it. The only reason the building was standing because it was just used to doing it. The building was ready to collapse. Walls were cracking. There would be an event taking place, and suddenly the chandelier started swinging because things were collapsing. Margaret Truman's piano leg went through the floor. Truman called in a panel of experts to take a look at the White House, and they were shocked. They could not believe the condition of the White House, and they couldn't believe it was still standing, considering the condition. And so a panel was put together, and they decided they were going to rebuild the entire White House, tear it all down. Now, in this day and age, there would have been a very, very different process. But this was in the 1950s, and they hadn't developed such processes yet. And so the plan was, and Harry Truman pushed to save the original walls. He said, save the walls, at least preserve that. And so they did. But they gutted the whole interior of the White House. People do not realize this. You know, a lot of times when they sit there and say, the White House is 200... No, it isn't. The White House was basically finished in its present form in 1952. Basically 72 years now. And one of the fascinating things is once everything was done, and there are fascinating pictures, I recommend you take a look at this and take a look at the utter devastation that takes place within the White House. When it was all done, there was a report made. And this brings us to the last book in this little series I'm doing. And this is the report on the Commission on the Renovation of the Executive Mansion. Actually, this was given to the Secretary of the Army, this volume, in 1952, November the 26th, 1952. And this goes through the entire process. I mean, you can see here, you know, basically they made it a steel building, a steel structured building within the walls. Everything was taken out. It was completely gutted. And unfortunately, a lot was destroyed. It's kind of unfortunate in that regard. I think this is an interesting thing just to show you. This is the wording here at the beginning of this book. I want to hold it here so you can read it for a second. And an interesting thing here also to show you, if I may, here you can see here, you know, things being done. They're cutting way down. They built sub-basements and stuff like that under the White House. And this is, of course, the committee with President Truman. And this is very, very important because it changed the house. It wasn't the same house. I mean, the walls are original, but nothing much else is. I mean, there were a few things replaced here and there, but a lot of it was basically redone. The floors and everything else were replaced, because if you think about it, since this was basically an office building built within the walls of the White House, there were heavy reinforced concrete floors on each level, no longer the wood floors that had held everything up. Yes, they were covered in wood or linoleum, whichever it may be, but it is no longer the house that it once was. But it is within the walls that had been there since the time of John Adams. That remains. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the White House and these various books. You know, and once again, the Octagon House, which doesn't get talked about too often. But that was the center of government after the Great Fire in 1814 by the British. And of course, the many changes that took place, you know, with gas, electricity, and, you know, remember the whole thing with Ike Hoover. You know, he got his job basically because he was willing to touch electric switches. They have a lot more classifications now to become chief usher, besides being able to touch an electric switch. Things have changed a lot. But think about this. This is really an amazing thing. A lot of people don't know about this. And this is a remarkable report. And I'm very, very happy and very honored to have a copy of this limited edition in my library. And so this is my little talk. Certainly not a complete talk, but just a little bit of a talk on the White House and a few books in my library that talk about it. And there are many others in my library that do mention the White House here and there. But I thought these three books represent very important moments in the changes, in the style, and of course the improvements of the White House, the president's home. Thank you.